All right, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Worst Spot Icon Series channel here in Savvy, hosted by Worst Spot Community Envoy Matt Patrick. Before we start, really quickly, I just want to share a few details for everybody who's joining us really quickly. To your right, you'll see a chat box, and I see there's a lot of activity. We see people from Sweden, San Francisco, Australia, Barbados, Jamaica. Wow, this is awesome. This is phenomenal. And thank you for everyone who's joining us today. If during the live stream, if you have any questions, in the very bottom, you can certainly press on that and ask any questions. Your host, Matt Patrick, will be checking it out and asking to and responding to any questions everybody has. All right, I leave you guys on great hands with your host, Matt Patrick.
Oh, thank you, Patty. It's a pleasure to be back, and I will say it's a pleasure to do my first time with you doing the Icon series. Previously, Will Hokenga has handled these, so it's been a little while since we've done one. I just want to fill up before we introduce our very special guest, Michael. I just want to fill people in a little bit about the Icon series, maybe people who have not seen it before. Essentially, during COVID, as the Worst Spot Community Envoy, we wanted to create educational content for people who could not make it to distilleries, maybe couldn't travel. And amongst the things we did is not only a series where we took people into the rum distilleries and meeting the master distillers, we also decided it was a great time, especially back then it was Worst Spot's 50th anniversary, and we wanted to celebrate the many people who have made Caribbean rum what they are today. And so we created the Icon series, where we've interviewed amazing people who have a long history in the Caribbean rum industry, including people like Joyce Bence and Margaret Montplaisir, Evan Brown, Lloyd Forbes, John Georges. It's been an amazing treat for me as somebody who loves rum and as a rum historian to be able to talk with these people and learn their stories. And we're incredibly lucky and proud to bring you another icon today, Michael Delevante, who has a very long history. I believe it's almost 60 years, coming up shortly, 60 years working with the Caribbean rum industry. So I want to say hello to Michael Delevante. Welcome.
Hi.
So Michael, just a brief introduction. Michael Delevante has worked with Wray and Nephew for decades, and at a very technical role, and we'll be drilling into that in the next hour or so. And Michael, first question for you. Tell us about your life before you joined the rum industry and what sort of prepared you to work in the industry.
I was born in Jamaica, went to high school in Jamaica, and then in '59, I went to Stevens Institute of Technology in Hoboken, New Jersey.
Oh, yeah.
Famous for where Frank Sinatra was born. But it was a good university, and I studied engineering and graduated in '63. And then I was actually interviewed for jobs in America with other companies, but I wanted to go back to Jamaica. So I connected to one of the directors of Wray and Nephew, who happened to be related, and asked him if I could come and work down there. And he said they just had a job opening for somebody who could liaison with a consultant that they had from England who had worked with Wray and Nephew from the 50s. And he needed somebody to liaise with him about what was happening at the distillery. So I took it, and then that was the start of the career.
Okay. And your degree was chemical engineering?
Yeah, chemical engineering, yeah.
Okay.
But I majored in that. But then after I met this gentleman, I didn't actually meet him. I had to go to England to meet him. I was sent to England for a few months to train under him. And I was very lucky to visit several distilleries. Only one made rum, actually, or spirit from molasses. And I spent time there. And then that prepared me for going back to Appleton to work, but not to live for the beginning. But that's what I did.
Okay. So you joined Wray and Nephew in around 1963 or so?
Yeah,
Okay.
July.
Yeah, okay, in July of 1963. So, so you mentioned gin. I think there's an interesting story around about gin and Wray and Nephew in the 1950s, and how it was distilled. Can you tell us about that?
Well, the first introduction to this gentleman or this consultant was he worked for a company called Nicholson's in England, and they wanted to make Nicholson's gin and Holloway's gin in Jamaica. So he had them install a APV still hydro selection system to make alcohol just for making gin. And there was a small gin still, I think it was 100 gallons or something that they installed. And the gin business became so big that eventually they put in a 500 gallon still to make not Nicholson gin, Holloway's gin, Bowles gin, Gilby's gin, and another one called Lamplighter, which he gave them all the formulas and everything, right? Or we got all the formulas. We made them under license. And then this pot still actually made Wolfschmidt vodka by redistilling spirit from another still, which was interesting. So the gin still was very active. We used to make quite a bit every year of these 5 brands. And this APV still made in England, we are actually started to make alcohol from it to make Smirnoff vodka and a local vodka. So it was very active, but it was very small. I think it was a 12-inch diameter columns. And that's what I inherited when I went to work at Wray and Nephew.
Right. And so, if I remember correctly, when we discussed this earlier, that we were often told, like at least among rum geeks, we're told that the first column still came to Jamaica in 1960 or so, but that would have been the first rum column still. It sounds like what you're telling us is there was actually column distillation in Jamaica earlier than that.
About 55. In fact, they got it under a special arrangement as pioneers for making alcohol. But at the same time, Innswood Estate had a coffee still that they had got from Canada, which was called the Innswood still. And Wray and Nephew eventually bought that at Appleton, put it in at Appleton, and that was starting to make their rum, their coffee still rum. So they were then making rum on a column still, plus 4 very small pot stills, and the alcohol on the APV still.
Right. And it's interesting. You mentioned the various brands that were made there, and it brings to mind just in looking in my own history research and looking back through old advertisements for Wray and Nephew, they were not just rum. They were actually distributors for many other types of wine and spirits.
It was a huge distributor, yeah, for whiskeys and other vodkas and everything. I think they probably distributed more imported stuff than they made their own in those days. Because in those days was the dagger rums that were popular,
right,
and not even overproof rum at that time.
Right. And if I remember correctly, actually, I'm sort of jumping a little out of sequence here, but you told me an interesting story about the introduction of before your time, of course, but the introduction of the Appleton Special, sort of an unusual story about Appleton Special arriving. Can you tell us about that?
Well, during the war, when whiskey was, and they were able to get Scotch whiskey in the clubs, especially where the affluent people were accustomed to whiskey, there was a manager at Appleton who decided to make a special rum from cane juice, from what I understood, and it was sold at 40% alcohol, which was illegal, right? So it was called Appleton Special, sold only to clubs, and it was not a general market. And because it was 40% only, they had to put it under the counter at the various clubs, and it became known as bend down, because to avoid anybody from the excise seeing it, the bartender had to bend down to get it. So Appleton Special's first name was really, the nickname was Bend Down. And that's a brand that's continued until recently.
Yeah. It's sort of interesting. It makes me wonder if that was the sort of the the introduction of Appleton Estate, of Appleton as a brand rather than sort of the splitting of Appleton versus J. Wray and Dagger as the focus. Feels like that's when Appleton became its own brand, not just a distillery.
It would have obviously been the first Appleton brand, okay, and then came the Appleton Estate brands, which still exist.
Right. Okay. So early on, we've talked a little about your gin distilling. Early on, you became a distillery supervisor for Appleton. This would have been in the mid-1960s. Can you tell us about the rum making equipment and the distillery setup for making rum at the time?
Well, in '65, right, even in '63, there was some old concrete. There were concrete fermenters with a concrete, what is known as a bub tank, right, which was a yeast propagating tank, and they used Fleischmann's yeast to make rum, which is interesting. And then they had the Innswood still, the coffee still, which was not a huge capacity. They had the APV still, and they had 4 small pot stills, 1,200 gallons, 1,500 gallons, and I'm speaking English gallons, British gallons, right? Imperial
gallons.
And then 2,000 pot stills, which were heated by internal coils, which was a pain because when they scaled up, somebody had to go in the still to hammer out the scale that had built up on the coils. So we had 4 pot stills, the Innswood still, one called a Ramsden, which never worked very well. I don't know where they got it. And they had the APV still.
Oh, interesting. Yeah, if I remember correctly, I remember when we had Lloyd, I think it was Lloyd Forbes on, and he talked about, I'm forgetting the name of it, but he talked about basically starting to heat the stills from like an external jacket, like a Candelaria or something like that.
A Calandria.
Yeah,
okay,
yeah.
That was the third phase. After the coils, we put in what they call internal calandrias, which is a heat exchange system where you put steam around coils that boil the rum. But they became a pain in the neck to clean too. So we put in external calandrias, which is also known as a reboiler, where the wash from the pot circulates through this thing that looks like a condenser, obviously. And steam is put into that, and then that heats up the wash, and it circulates back to the pot. So that's a boiling apparatus.
Excellent. So, yeah, it sounds like Appleton's capacity has increased substantially since those days. The number of stills are much bigger and everything.
Well, in 1971, we abandoned all the column stills and put in a large 54-inch diameter, 3 54-inch diameter columns, using what is called an extractive system. So we had a consultant then who designed it for us, and it was made in Canada, and it tripled our production. And what was good is that we actually had our own boiler for the distillery, which made it very efficient. And so the production went up very largely in 72 because of this column, which if you only operated 2 columns, we made a light rum, which duplicated what the coffee still had made. And if you made all 3 columns, you made alcohol, which was growing in capacity. We had a lot of alcohol needed now because we were making more, right? And if you could also operate the 3 columns to make a very light rum. So we were actually making a coffee still type, a light rum, and alcohol on this one system.
Oh, interesting.
We
talked a little bit about Appleton, and we know, and of course, Appleton is sort of the flagship of the J. Wray and Nephew. But there's been another distillery that's been part of J. Wray and Nephew for a number of years. And I believe you mentioned your family has a connection to that other distillery. Can you tell us about that?
It was a New Yarmouth distillery. The name of it was New Yarmouth. It was about 40 miles from Kingston and 40 miles from Appleton. And they built a 12,000 ton sugar factory in 1948. It was the first crop. And they put in 2, I think, pot stills, merely to use up the molasses, because in those days molasses was a waste product, right? So they actually put in 2 pot stills, or just to have some way to use up the molasses or dispose of. And they made rum for a company called Sheriff's. And I think at some stage later, Appleton, Wray and Nephew bought some of this rum from this company that my grandfather and his brothers started in 48.
Yeah, interesting. So you're and so was that the Henriques family?
Henriques, yes.
Okay, Henriques, sorry. Yeah,
Okay.
and to my understanding as well, just to try to connect some dots, is I believe the sheriff that they were they the ones who also owned Long Pond?
I hear that they did get some rum from there, or they owned, but it was also, I think it was a Seagram subsidiary, you know.
Okay.
Spirits was.
Yeah, if it's the same family, if it's a sheriff family, my recollection is they owned Long Pond at some point, and if it's them, they own the Bowmore Scotch whiskey distillery in
Was that right? I didn't even know that.
Scotland.
Okay.
So yeah, it's a fascinating little bit of history there around the transition between ownerships in the 1940s, 1950s, 1960s. Okay, so in 1973, you moved to Kingston and took over as the manager for the wine and liquor division. Tell us about what that role was like.
Well, we built I think it was a winery that could do about 2 million liters of wine. It was, they had made wine before this, but we actually had Wray and Nephew once did Canadian soft drinks, was it? And then they abandoned that, and then they Canada Dry soft drink, sorry, and that went bust, and then they turned the building into a winery, which I designed or helped design and helped commission, and then we made a lot of wines from British style wines from imported grape must. And then we also had a liqueur department that made Bowles liqueurs. So I was manager of that, but I was also overseeing some of the things that happened at both distilleries by that time. And I developed a few wine liqueurs, which some of them still exist, like sherry and all that. And I developed a coffee liqueur called La Donna. But the interesting thing is I also were able to make wine for the Catholic Church, communion wine, right?
Okay.
Because in those days you couldn't import very much wine, and so even Harvey's Bristol Cream, which was a big product in Jamaica, we actually made a sherry to augment what could not be imported as Harvey's. So it's a rather large winery, and the liqueur department is very active as well. But I still have some responsibility, as I said, for the two distilleries.
Okay. So by that point, were you sort of day-to-day managing, sort of overseeing what was going on at Appleton and New Yarmouth, or just sort of consulting?
Consulting, basically, right? Most day-to-day was mostly the winery and the liqueur, but okay. I was going out to the estates quite frequently, though, but maybe once a week to see what was happening.
I think you mentioned at some point a coffee liqueur.
I did make a coffee liqueur
okay,
because I used to dabble in things, right?
Okay.
I tried to make a pimento allspice gin, but that didn't work out too well. But
interesting. Yeah. So, but that coffee liqueur was not, when I think of Jamaican coffee liqueur, I think of Tia Maria. But this was not that.
No, this was in competition to Tia Maria. Okay. And in fact, you probably might know that Wray and Nephew actually bought the Tia Maria plant later on, right?
Okay. I didn't know that.
We didn't own the brand. We were making it for Hiram Walker. And then, so we ran the coffee liqueur. We made the concentrate for Hiram Walker and Tia Maria for local and West Indian consumption. And then there, I was also a consultant, but that was when I was living in Canada now. And we made a line of liqueurs called Lilyfield, which actually overtook Bowles liqueurs in Jamaica and replaced them.
Oh, interesting.
It's very complicated.
Yeah. So it sounds like you did much more than just rum. It sounds like you've done everything alcoholic in Jamaica.
We did most things. Yeah, we made a native brandy and all sorts of things, right?
Oh, interesting.
The only thing we didn't make is cognac, of course, and whiskey.
Okay. But no grapes growing in Jamaica, though.
No.
Okay.
Not commercially, no.
Okay.
But the grape must that we imported from Cyprus and places like that was what we made the wine from. And then we also made from the same wine that in the winery, Noye Prat Vermouth and Cinzana Vermouth and Dubonnet.
Oh, wow. So if you did a brandy, so that would have also have been from the must imported and then...
No, the brandy was native brandy, sorry.
Yeah.
Made from a flavor. We didn't try making brandy from scratch.
Okay. Sounds good. So now, you mentioned Canada earlier, so we want to now move along to Canada. In 1977, you moved there and started working with McGuinness Distillers. Tell us about what you're doing in Canada for them and how you still manage to remain connected with Wray and Nephew.
No, I was very lucky when I moved to Canada in 77 that McGuinness had just been appointed by the then managing director of Wray and Nephew as bottlers for Appleton, which was distributed in Canada in a small amount. There were 24,000 cases sold a year of Appleton Special and Appleton White. So I got hired, not by coercion with the people, but it was suggested that I'd be useful there. And I actually replaced a West Indian engineer at McGuinness, which was the third largest distillery in Canada and had four different locations in Saskatchewan and British Columbia. And they made rum, by the way, in Bridgetown, Nova Scotia.
Oh, yeah?
And the reason why they chose Bridgetown was the man who owned McGuinness, Larry McGuinness, decided that if he put it in Bridgetown, people would think it came from Bridgetown, Barbados. I used to go there to help them make rum as well. And they made it in a weird way, but it worked. Because you don't always work still the same way, right? But anyway, so I worked at McGuinness as engineering manager. And then I was there 13 years, and I ended up as technical director when Corby bought it. And that was the end of me. But we made everything there except brandy.
Okay, interesting.
And
if I remember correctly, Corby at some later point, I think, acquired other interesting rum brands. I can't remember if it's Lemon Hard.
Lamb's rum?
Lamb, yes, it was Lamb's I was thinking of. So yeah, there's a whole lot of Canadian connection to rum history that a lot of people, at least in the United States, don't know about. But I don't think I told you this, but recently I learned that the reason 151 rum, the reason it's that particular strength, is because it was a high enough proof that it wouldn't freeze. The miners and the expedition people in the northern parts of Canada, when they would take rum up there, it wouldn't freeze at that strength. And it was originally at 32 overproof in the imperial system. But when they started selling that rum in the U.S., it became 151 American proof.
Well, that's interesting too, because Wray and Nephew had a 151, which we bottled at McGuinness as a trial run. We had to do it. It was very unsafe because this bottling plant was not geared for high proof spirits. So we had to do it very carefully, right? And on a Saturday when nobody was there to watch it being done. And then, of course, Bacardi had 151, which had a fire warning label on it. There was a fire warning on the label too, right? And then, of course, Wray and Nephew sold a lot of rum to Newfoundland to make Screech.
Right.
Right. And they sold bulk rum as well to customers who bottled it under their own names. But McGuinness was very huge in liqueurs, which I worked with, and whiskeys. So I learned to make whiskey, and we also made gin and other products.
Okay.
The only thing we imported was brandy from France.
Okay. So was it? Did you find it interesting to make, or how did you find it interesting or different to make Canadian whiskey as opposed to a rum?
Well, of course, you're using grains, right? Mostly corn in Ontario, and rye to a point, and then you have to cook it. So there's a whole other process, whereas in molasses, you just go straight from the sugar, right? So I learned how to convert starch into sugar by a cooking method. And it was a huge distillery. We actually, when I was there, sold 2 million cases a year of various products. They had about 300 products that they sold. And they were huge in liqueurs. McGuinness was very famous for its liqueurs.
Interesting. Okay. So it was the same stills, whether you were making rum or a whiskey there?
Well, the rum was made in Nova Scotia, as I said, with a similar still. But in McGuinness, which is interesting, we had a 3-column still, which made the whiskey and alcohol for vodka. We were big in vodka. And McGuinness made the first white Canadian domestic rum in Canada, which was interesting too. So we were making rum there and buying some from mostly from Guyana, Barbados, and then when I got there, I encouraged them to buy some from Wray and Nephew. So we had 3 West Indian rums in the McGuinness rum, which was very good.
Oh, nice. Okay, yeah. And I do remember that you were talking about Canada 1970s, and that was actually, just as a sort of historical context for our viewers, that was basically one of WRSPA's very first missions when they were formed in 1971. One of the very first things that they focused quite a bit of effort on was getting into the Canadian market.
Well, there was an organization called the Association of Canadian Distillers, of which I was a member on the technical committee, and we met nearly every year, I think it was, with WRSPA to discuss common interests, right? And I don't know if you remember, there was an issue with ethyl carbamate. You know what that is, right?
Right, yep.
Where that was a big issue, where Barbados was tested and they found some excess, but it was a wrong test that was done. So that was a big mistake and a big political issue. And I don't think ethyl carbamate was ever mentioned before that happened. But luckily, it was a wrong test that was done at the LCBO. So Barbados benefited by the advertising they got for it, and it was a false alarm. So,
yeah.
But we used to meet quite regularly, as I said, which was more social than it was technical. So they were a lot of fun. And we met in Barbados, we met in Jamaica, and a few other places. So I was lucky to be on the technical committee of the ACD.
Excellent. Yeah. No, I do remember hearing some of the other people talk about ethyl carbamate issues at various times. In fact, if I remember correctly, chatted with Frank Ward about us with some point, like they were how he was having to work and change some of his distilling process so that Mount Gay's rum could not trigger that limit. So.
Well, they said that the cause of it was urea as a nutrient for the yeast.
Right.
I'm not sure it's our not enough copper in the distills and things like that. So it really became it was almost a political issue too. So.
Right. So just real quick, Alex Kong, or Zan as we call him, he said to say to you, Mark Elliott just came into my office and says to say hi.
Oh, I remember him, right? He was the engineer at Appleton.
Yeah.
When I was consulting there.
Excellent. So you were with McGuinness for many years, and then at some point you left. Tell us about what was after McGuinness.
Well, I was there 13 years, and then I was actually the first person to know that it was for sale on the staff, right? Because Corby was involved in that. So I had a terrible task of, for 1 year, shutting down McGuinness. Prior to that, there were other 3 plants that we shut down, but I had the terrible task of having to shut down the company. They made me the manager of the factory, the distillery, which was a depressing time in my life, obviously. And they offered me a job after I would have shut it down. And the interesting thing is that when we were shutting it down, we had to ship all our barrels, 250,000 barrels, to Corbyville. And 2 weeks before we were to ship the last barrels, the manager of Corby came in and said that I was to fire the last 12 people left there because they had found a chicken in the bottom of the barrels we had shipped to Corby, which I don't know how a chicken could fit through a bunghole, but anyway. So that was the end of that. And then they took me to Corby to look for housing and all that. And that didn't work out, for which I wasn't sorry. And I was without a job for about 6 months. Interestingly, Corby itself shut down 2 years later. So I waited for 6 months, and then I applied back for a job at Wray and Nephew, and I was accepted. And in 1990, I went back to Jamaica to live and became manager of production at Wray and Nephew.
Oh, wow. That's a substantial role. So at some point in there, you started your own consulting company. When was that?
Well, in 1992, when I wanted to come back to Canada, I decided that I couldn't get a job at whatever age I was, 40-something years old, and the distilleries in Canada diminished tremendously. They got from about 10 down to 5. So there was no chance of getting a job in a distillery. So I decided the only thing to do was to become a consultant. So I learned how to do that, or set up my little business with 3 associates, just to say I had associates. Consultant for Wray and Nephew, having to go down there for up to 2 weeks every month for a long time. And during that time, I found a new still a second-hand still for them in Lethbridge, Alberta, that came to be installed at Yarmouth because it was growing in size. And it was actually owned by Wray and Nephew, the still in Appleton, Yarmouth, even though Yarmouth itself was owned by the Henriques family. So, and then we put some new pot stills in at Yarmouth as well, one big pot still. So I was looking after the 2 distilleries. And I also, as a consultant, had the pleasure of accompanying Lloyd Forbes to India on 2 occasions to look about environmental issues, because in India they're very good at cleaning up waste done. And of course, India is one of the biggest rum producing countries in the world, right? So we went there on a trip, and then many things happened during my 30 years of, and that ended with during that time too, I was made president of Wray and Nephew Canada, which was a company that looked after now bottling of Appleton, and I also was looking after the bottling of Appleton in 4 different countries: the US, Mexico, New Zealand, Canada, and the States. So that was a lot of fun with traveling too, right? I joined Wray and Nephew, saw the world. But and then when we were at the peak of sales of Appleton in Canada, it rose to 402,000 standard cases, which was huge.
That's amazing.
And Mexico is huge. So I used to go to Mexico every year. And I actually helped design, when they moved from Cuervo as a bottler to Herradura, I actually helped design a rather large blending capacity area for Herradura.
Oh, interesting.
So I did a lot of traveling, and it was a lot of fun.
So are there any other like well-known companies that you can share with us that you also did consulting for?
Well, I did a little bit in Cuervo. Actually, they wanted to make a different kind of tequila, or use a different kind of still to make tequila. And I helped them. I went down there, and that didn't last for too long. But anyway, I think they've implemented some of the things I tried. I did some work in, I think, where was it now? I went to Israel as a consultant to help a Russian company, make vodka in Israel. That's a long story, which I won't bore you with. So I've been around quite a few places working for other companies.
Excellent. So you mentioned New Yarmouth, and my understanding is that New Yarmouth, which is somewhat of a mystery distillery to many of us rum enthusiasts. Like, we may know it exists, but we don't often see much written about it. My understanding is that it went through a fairly substantial renovation in the 1990s. Can you tell us anything about that? And what happened there? What did you do or help do?
Well, I think in 1990, I don't remember. I have it some written there, but we brought us a second-hand still, a used still from Lethbridge, Alberta, a huge 3-column thing, which was actually the same design as the one at Appleton that we had put in 71. And we put that in at Yarmouth to replace the coffee still that had been moved from Appleton to Yarmouth, okay, which was owned by Wray and Nephew, even though they didn't own the whole distillery. So we brought this still from Lethbridge, Alberta, had it installed, so we're making alcohol and more rum at Appleton, at Yarmouth than before. And that has just recently been replaced by Campari with a new 3-column still of the same design. We also put in some bigger pot stills at Yarmouth. So production at Yarmouth increased tremendously. And in 1985, Wray and Nephew, under its own parent company called Lascelles de Mercado, bought Yarmouth. And we made a lot of the rum there, especially a part of the overproof rum.
Right. And my recollection is like some of what New Yarmouth, the improvements to New Yarmouth in the 1990s were to allow them to make a heavier rum. Is that true, or can you?
Right.
Yeah.
Okay.
Tell us about that.
Winston Kennedy, right, who worked at Hampden, left Hampden for some reason, I don't know, but the managing director, Billy McCall of Yarmouth, wanted to put in a high-ester distillery. So if you call that an improvement, it was, right? And we had an extra separate distillery, quite remote from the main distillery. So we didn't want the yeast from one to cohabit with the other one, right? So,
yeah, okay, that's smart.
So right, so we made 4 marks there, which I think you're aware of.
But share for our audience what they are, because I know them, but I don't know everybody in our audience does.
Okay, there were 4 different levels of high ester rum, right? One was called HM, one was called RH, one was called WM, and one was called WK. These were the initials of 4 people, as marks usually were, right? Mm-hmm. Sometimes they were named after the people who invented them, or named after people that were prominent in the company. So they made 4 different marks, and they were competing now with Hampden, I don't know how successfully, and selling to sheriffs in, no, not sheriffs, share in Holland, yeah. Right? And so on. And I don't know if it's still operating, to be honest with you, because I've been there since 2013 when Campari bought it.
Okay.
So there was a separate distillery. And then I designed 2 stills to supplement the 3-column still that they'd got from Lethbridge. One was a beer column that I had made in Scotland, and a rectifying column to make more light rum.
Okay.
So it became quite a huge distillery with it. And because the sugar factory had been shut down, it had its own steam supply and everything like that. And then the issue with many distilleries in Jamaica is the environmental issue of where do you put the dunder or the vinasse, right?
Right.
And with the shutdown of several sugar factories in Jamaica, this has become an issue, which I won't go into because everybody knows.
Yeah. So to touch back on your what you mentioned about marks there, I know the people who love the high ester Jamaican rum, they know, for example, that the DOK mark from Hampton is 1600 esters. They know that Long Pond's TECC is 1600 esters, and they may know of NYEWK, and that WK would be
Winston Kennedy.
Winston Kennedy. Interesting. Yes. I will confess I learned that from you about it. Should have made sense though. And then there's another one. There was the RH mark. Do you know who that would be?
Robert Henriques.
Ah, okay. And
one of the director of Wray and Nephew.
Okay, yes, a family member, if I remember correctly.
That's right. Okay. He's my cousin, actually.
Excellent. Okay. So and I actually just want to clarify for my own curiosity. So you're saying that the New Yarmouth distillery that was making rum up till the 1990s, it was sort of separate, is a separate distillery from where the high ester rum was made. Sort of kept a fair bit.
Yeah.
Okay. Like dozens of yards apart, or like miles apart?
No, it was dozens.
Okay. Excellent. Yeah, because I will confess that I've gone on to Google Maps and looked at satellite imagery and tried to make sense of what I see there. So
it was a little bit. It was far enough that the yeast wouldn't migrate.
Excellent.
If it even would have in any case, right? But anyway.
Okay. So looking back over your technical career up to that point, like what are some of the things that you're most proud of, that you would say these are things where I feel like I made a substantial contribution to the industry or to the company in terms of new technologies or improving technologies?
Well, one of the companies I've had fun working with the late owner of St. Lucia Distillers.
Mm-hmm.
I actually went down there and helped them with their column still.
Laurie Bernard?
Right, and I was very close to him, and unfortunately he passed. So I know Margaret as well, right, who is obviously attending this thing.
She's been on our Icon series as well. So
right, okay.
Yeah.
And I also had in my little group a guy who used to work at McGuinness, who did product development under my I didn't teach him, I found him there, right? But I got him jobs in places like St. Lucia Distillers to develop products too, and a few other places. So, and also he helped with the development of these line of liqueurs in Wray and Nephew, including some RTDs and other things. So, and we worked on that together. So, the fun I had in my career was at McGuinness, where I was allowed to do anything I wanted. We put in some very huge barrel handling system where it was all done manually before. I modified the distill itself. We put in some automation, and I just had a lot of fun doing things down there that I was allowed to. We put in energy saving devices on the stills, which saved energy and steam. And as I said, I progressed quite well through there to become technical director of the company. And other things was the design of these two stills at Yarmouth, the two column stills. And since then, I've designed quite a few distilleries in America and to make bourbon.
Okay.
And a big one now in Canada to make whiskey for a company that was once this Sleeman family owned Sleeman breweries, and they put in a distillery. So I designed that. And I've been making quite a few designs in America and in England. I even went and helped somebody make rum. And we're making on what they call the hybrid stills, which are pot with a column, right? Which are becoming quite popular and quite effective in making rum too. So there's been a huge amount of experience I've had, and I'm blessed to have had that, right, in my consulting career.
Can you share any of the American distilleries that are making whiskey? Can you share any of their names for those of us who enjoy bourbon as well?
I did a distillery in Scotland, not in Scotland, in Austin, Texas, called Still Austin Whiskey. That's been very successful. And I designed a single column for them that made bourbon, which is quite unlike the normal bourbon stills. So they're doing quite well. And I've been helping another company build stills that I've designed for some other bourbon manufacturers in America. And I helped a guy in a distillery in Massachusetts who had bought a hybrid still from Germany. I went down there and I commissioned it for them because they were making rum too. And the funny thing is, I met them through another guy I helped make rum in Connecticut. And they came and saw me, and they said they'd set up their molasses to be fermented. And for 3 weeks, it hadn't fermented. So I told them why, because they were keeping it too cold. And then I got a job out of that.
Oh, interesting. So, yeah, when you say hybrid still in Massachusetts, it makes me think of Privateer. But can you share whether it was them or not?
No, I know who the lady who worked there, I think. What's her name? I can't remember.
Maggie
Campbell, right? She's now in Barbados.
Yeah.
I met her there, right? But it wasn't Privateer.
Okay.
But there are some big ones that have some rather large hybrid stills. Yes. And they become popular in Canada too, right?
Yeah, so. For sure. So you've touched on this briefly already, but can you've worked with many icons of Caribbean rum, and I couldn't dream of listing them all, but the two that have come to mind are Lloyd, Forbes, and Winston Kennedy. Can you share any of your experiences working with them, like what you did with them?
Well, okay. Winston was the association with him was really with the highest distillery at Yarmouth, right? his son also came and worked at Yarmouth, so I knew him. But I was learning from Winston rather than being associated that much. But Lloyd and I traveled various places. I said to India, and he was employed at one time to Appleton, where he expanded the distillery quite significantly, the fermenting house and all that. And I also worked on expanding it even further by adding 2 more fermenters. And of course, that was really it was more social with Lloyd than it was technical.
Business.
But we did meet a lot, right? And we were good friends, that's all.
That's great. That's great. So outside of Wray and Nephew, have you done in more recent years, have you done any consulting for other Jamaican distilleries?
I did a little bit of Hamden, where they added 2 pot stills, and I've done a little bit for Worthy Park.
Oh, good. Okay. Yes, I know. I've read that Hampton has ordered or has now 2 additional 5,000 gallon stills. Was that?
They're working, yeah.
Okay, excellent. Yes, and you mentioned Worthy Park. I see. Zan is on here, so I'm sure now. I know why.
You mean Alex?
Yeah, Alex. Yes, we call him Zan.
Oh, sorry. Okay.
Yeah,
I saw him up to last week in Jamaica.
Yeah.
Well, another thing I've done that I've enjoyed is I've actually designed a winery, that not to make wine, but to convert wine into something else.
Okay, but not brandy.
No, I've tried to make brandy in the McGuinness had a winery out in British Columbia, and they had a brandy still that somebody had designed, and they asked me to go there and try and use some of their wine to make brandy, right? The problem is he made it all of stainless steel, so that wasn't too successful. So that's the first and last time I've had that influence on trying to make brandy.
Yes. Okay.
It wasn't the fault of the process, it was the fault of the still that I didn't design.
So besides making all sorts of distilled spirits and liqueurs over your career, you've also written a book. Can you tell us about that?
Okay, there's the rum book that ADI put out. I wrote 2 chapters in it. They only put my name under 1 chapter, right? But they took from another book I'd written called Spirits in the Making. They used some of the chapters from that to publish that book with 2 other guys who you probably know. And I've written a book called 56 Years in the Industry and Still Counting that I've done, which I've sent you a copy, by the way.
Excellent. Looking forward to it. Okay.
And I've done an autobiography. That was not technical. So I've actually written 2 books. I have a third one that I've drafted, but I haven't had it published yet. If I may, never.
Okay. So the book that I'm thinking of that I can see on Amazon, for example, is A Distiller's Guide to Rum. Is that which one is that? Which one is that?
That's the first one. That's the second one.
Okay.
So they took 2 of my chapters from Spirits in the Making that dealt with rum and put that into that book. So the first chapter is they have me as the author, but they didn't have the other chapter that I wrote.
Okay.
They didn't have me as the author, but that's okay.
Okay. And are these fairly technical books, or for distillers, or would enthusiasts enjoy them as well?
I think the first one, The Spirits in the Making, which I published myself, right, and I have no more left. But that would have been helped to a distiller. It was actually written originally as a sales training manual for people at McGuinness, and then I turned it into a book. And the second book is, as I said, half of it is my autobiography in the business, and the other half is how to design a craft distillery and how to cook grains and everything technical, right? What you need to, how much the distillery might cost to build, and everything that is needed in a distillery.
So before we get to our final question here, I've asked our listeners if they have any questions. Now is the time to throw them into the ask a question box. We'll give you some time to chat while hopefully people will ask some questions. But at least my final question is, Caribbean rum. You've been in it for almost 60 years, been in it around it. Do you have any thoughts on where you think Caribbean rum is headed in the next 5 to 10 years?
I think Caribbean rum will always be the famous rum, right, in the world. I mean, because of how it started and everything, and it was probably the first country. But there's so many other countries making rum now, right? And one of the problems the Caribbean has in expanding it is because there's not much sugar grown in the Caribbean, right? Even Puerto Rico, I gather, has no sugar. And if you don't have that, it's very hard to get rid of the effluents. And a biogas plant, which you need for a distillery, is a huge expense. And not only that, it's probably harder to operate than a distillery is. Right? It probably costs more than a distillery. So there's an interesting distillery in Grenada now. You've probably heard of, right?
Renegade. We've had them on. Yeah, we've had them on our series on our Rum Talk series where we've met with Renegade.
Well, he's making an agricole, I gather, right?
Agricole style. The French don't like it when you call it agricole.
What's that?
The French don't like it when you call it agricole if it's not made there.
Well, that's what. That's what's interesting about him doing it, right?
Yeah.
But you know that agricole has a specific definition in the Food and Drug Act in Canada,
right?
With the amount of esters it has to have, right? But be that as it may, if we don't do something about the environmental issues, I think a lot of distilleries are going to have problems in the West Indies unless they have somewhere to put it, the waste.
Right. So we have a question here. Actually, before we get to the question, I was going to say that you bring up a good point about the lack of sugar in the Caribbean now, that the Caribbean sugar industries have had many challenges in recent years, and that's a topic I covered in my book a little bit, and we did a panel on it at the Miami Rum Congress, where we're starting to see that the larger distilleries and ones that hope to remain successful, they have to start taking more control of their supply chain. It's not like in the past where you could just call up Guyana and say, send us more molasses. Guyana itself is having to import molasses in some cases. And so I think we're starting to see it's sort of a major directional change in rum is that more and more distilleries or brand owners are thinking we should be growing sugarcane to make rum from all of it, not we're going to make rum from the 20% of it that's left after we extract the sugar. And I think we're seeing more and more of that, and more new distilleries, like you mentioned, Renegade in Grenada, also Cobalt Tree in Belize. They're starting to make rum from cane juice directly, using 100% of the sugarcane plant.
One of the problems with making from cane juice is keeping the cane juice, right? I don't know if you've ever been to River Antoine.
Yeah, I have.
That's an amazing distillery. But the thing about that is that most of the energy you use in a sugar factory is to juice the cane, right? So converting it to sugar and molasses is not a big deal in terms of energy usage, right? And if you don't have anywhere for the dunder to go, that becomes a problem, and a more expensive problem than, as I said, building a distillery.
Right.
And also a difficult one to operate. So.
Correct. Yeah. And I do know that, like, for example, I've been to Renegade, and they spend an enormous amount of time and money engineering waste treatment processes. It's actually, I think, one of their largest expenses actually is dealing with that in an environmentally conscious way.
Well, there's an interesting one that in Foursquare in Barbados that they treat their vinasse to a point, right?
Mm-hmm.
I don't know how successful it is. I've only been there once, but it's just an issue. And as I said, there's so many other countries now making rum because it's such a popular product that there's going to be competition in America and in England even. You never know, right?
Right, for sure. So we have 2 questions here. The first one is from my good friend Dave Russell. He asked, what characteristics do you value when selecting molasses for distillation?
Okay, it must have low ash, right? Which is, again, not as low as it used to be when it was hand harvested. Obviously, a higher sugar content. Now, there's 3 grades of molasses, right? There's fancy and there's refined and all kind of nonsense. But most people just use the blackstrap molasses, which is the last straw, so to speak. But you want to have a high sugar content and low ash. That's basically it.
Okay.
I think.
And our second question is, are your books available to the general public?
The one called Spirits in the Making, I only produced about 300 and I sold them and gave them away too. But so that's not existing anymore. And the 56 years, I have a few more because I self-published it, and there are a few more in my office if anybody wants one.
Yeah. Excellent. Yes, I'm a self-publisher myself. So, all right, I think we are good for questions. I don't see anything else here. Any last words you'd like to say before we sign off?
Well, I can't think of any, but I thought I've covered everything. But if that gentleman wants an analysis of molasses, I gave a talk in Scotland about molasses at the university there that teaches about liquor. So if he would like to see an analysis that is ideal, I can happily send it to him if he wants.
Okay. Yeah, and Dave knows how to get a hold of me. So, so great, Michael. Thank you so much for this. This is fascinating. Some great history here, and you can count on me continuing to pester you with questions long after we sign off here. But thank you so much for agreeing to be a guest here, and like I said, it's a wonderful honor for me to interview yet another Caribbean icon. Federico, do you want to take us out?
Thank you for inviting me.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, this was phenomenal. Thank you so much. All right, guys. Well, thank you so much. Have a magnificent day.
Thank you.
Bye, Michael. Bye, Matt.
Take care, everybody.
Okay. Bye.